The night was cold and full of strange sounds and the human named. Rian dragged his feet through the soft dust of a planet that was never meant to be. His home, the sky above him, was dark green and filled with low clouds that pulsed with faint blue light, and his breathing was slow and heavy as he held a hand to the wound on his side. He had been running for hours, maybe more, in his legs. Felt like they would give out at any moment, but he could not stop, not yet, not while there was still a chance. Someone or something might find him. That was when he saw her standing at the edge of a rocky ridge. Her shape looked part human, but not quite. Her skin shimmered like fur under moonlight, and her eyes were sharp and glowing yellow. Her ears twitched with each sound, and a tail flicked behind her long legs. She tilted her head at him and sniffed the air before stepping closer. Her voice came out like a soft growl, mixed with words. "He could understand. You smell like blood and heat and fear," she said. And Rian raised his weapon with shaking hands. "Easy, human," she said again, and crouched low, not in fear but in caution. "I do not hunt the broken. I offer something else." Rian watched her closely, his grip still tight on the handle of the half-broken plasma blade, and he asked her what she meant. "Shelter, food, warmth, and protection." She said, "I know this place you do not, and the night here will eat you if—" "I do not. Why help me?" he asked, and her grin showed sharp teeth and something else he could not read. "Because I have need too," she said, and walked past him with a swing of her tail. "Follow if you want to live till morning." He had no better option, and his body ached too much to argue, so he followed her down a narrow path between dark stone cliffs lit only by flashes in the clouds above. They reached a small cave hidden behind a curtain of vines, and inside was warmer and dry and filled with scents he did not know, but found somehow calming. She lit a fire with a flick of her claw and sat across from him, watching him with interest while he sat in silence, wondering if this was a trick or some kind of trap. After a long pause, she said her name was Sari, and her kind once ruled this part of the wild lands, but now she was alone, hunted by those who feared her blood and hated her freedom. She asked him his name, and he gave it, and she nodded slowly and repeated it in her tongue like it was a taste she wanted to keep. "You are weak now," she said, "but not soft and not blind, and that is rare among your kind." Rian did not answer, but looked into the fire, his eyes tired and full of questions he could not ask. "Yeti offer a bond," she said, "one that helps both of us. I keep you alive and you give me what I seek, and what is that?" he asked. "You will know when the time comes," she said, and stood, her tail swaying behind her. "You have until morning to decide. If you stay, we are bound by the old ways. If you leave, you are food for the winds." She moved to a deeper part of the cave and curled into a nest of soft leaves and cloth, her eyes closed and her breath slow and even. Rian looked at the fire, and then at the path behind him, and then at the strange marks on the wall, glowing faintly like veins of light pulsing with life. He lay down with a groan and kept his hand near his weapon, his mind spinning with thoughts of survival and trust and fear. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes, and a sound woke him, not from outside, but from inside himself, like a voice whispering in a dream that was not his. Oni sat up fast and saw Sari standing over him, her eyes glowing in the firelight and a strange look on her face. "You have chosen," she said, and touched his chest with one clawed hand, her fingers warm and firm. "You belong here now, and you belong to me in ways you will not understand." Yatrian tried to speak, but she pressed a finger to his lips and said, "Sleep now, human. The bond has begun, and soon your scent will call to others, and they will know you are not prey anymore." He lay back down, not because he trusted her fully, but because his body. Rian opened his eyes slowly, and the cave around him was quiet except for the soft sound of dripping water somewhere in the shadows and the steady crackle of the fire that had burned through most of the night, and his body felt heavy but warmer than before, as if something unseen had wrapped around him in sleep. He sat up and looked at his shoulder, where a strange warm feeling pulsed like a second heartbeat, and when he pulled back the torn sleeve of his suit, he saw faint glowing lines like thin golden threads winding across his skin in a pattern he did not recognize. The marks looked ancient and alive, moving slightly with each breath, and when he touched them they felt like they belonged, like they had always been there waiting to wake. Sari stood near the cave entrance with her back turned and her ears twitching as she listened to the world beyond, and her tail moved slowly as if brushing thoughts from the air around her. "What did you do to me?" he asked, and his voice was rough but calm. She turned slowly, and her eyes studied him not with fear or guilt, but with a quiet pride. "The mark shows your choice," she said. "It is part of the old way, part of the bond you accepted when you stayed." "I never said yes," Rian muttered, but Sari tilted her head and stepped closer, her presence large and full even without touching him. "You stayed," she said, "and that is enough. The bond is not made with words, it is made with presence, with heat, with shared danger and promise." He looked again at the lines on his shoulder, and felt the truth in her words, even if he did not want to believe it, and a strange calm filled him. Though he tried to shake it off, they spent the day in silence, most of it anyway. As Sari moved through the cave preparing something with dried herbs and meat and roots she pulled from a sealed pouch, while Rian tried to sharpen his blade and repair a broken comb that no longer blinked, he watched her as she worked, with graceful movements and quiet control, and he saw how her ears twitched at each sound and how her nose lifted at each shift in scent, and he realized she knew more than she ever said. Later, as the light dimmed again and the cave grew colder, they sat near the fire, and she spoke of her people, how they once lived in vast roaming tribes, with deep connections not only to each other, but to the ground and sky and breath of every living thing. "We did not fear death," she said, "because we lived in cycles, and those we bonded with lived on through our memory, through our howl, through our young." Rian listened and said little, but her words stayed in his mind long after her voice faded. That night, while he slept, he dreamed of running, not alone, but with many beside him, all with glowing marks and eyes like fire in the dark, and he felt joy and hunger and purpose like he had never known. He woke with a sharp breath and looked over to see Sari already awake, watching him with that same unreadable expression. "You are feeling it now," she said. "Your blood starts to change, your senses will sharpen slowly, you are becoming more than you were." "I am still human," he said with force, but she nodded. "Yes, but not only human, not anymore, not to me, not to them." He asked, and Sari looked toward the cave entrance, where the wind had started to shift, and the air smelled of dust and coming rain. "There are others," she said, "and some may not like what we are." She moved closer and touched his shoulder where the mark glowed faintly. "This bond makes you part of a path older than your world and more dangerous than your wars, and if others see it, they will know, and they may come." He stood and felt a strange strength in his legs, like his muscles remembered something old and wild, and he met her eyes with a question he could not form into words. "You have time," she said, "but not forever, and the world will not wait for you to understand before it tests." Urian stepped outside the cave with her for the first time since his arrival, and the land stretched wide and broken with hills of stone and rivers of mist, and in the far distance something howled, and the sound made the ground vibrate softly beneath their feet. Sari sniffed the wind and smiled with a strange glint in her eyes. "They are near," she said, "not close, but near, and they will want to know who dares to make the old bond again with prey." He looked at her and then at his marked arm, and he said, "Only one thing, let them come." The cave shook with thunder as rain pounded the hills outside, and wind howled through the cracks in the stone, like voices crying through the dark, and Rian stood near the entrance, gripping the wall, while Sari worked to seal the flap of fur and cloth that kept the cold out. He had seen storms before on many planets, but this one was different, more alive, more wild, and full of a power that seemed to reach deep into the bones and twist something loose inside the chest. The fire flickered low, and the last of the food was already cooked and gone, and the warmth that had held the cave together during the day began to fade as the chill crept in like fingers through the cracks. Sari moved closer, and her breath came out in short bursts, white and soft in the air, and her tail wrapped around her leg, like it too could feel the coming cold. "We must share heat," she said, without looking at him, her voice low but steady, and her eyes fixed on the flames. Rian hesitated and took a step back, but his hands were already stiff, and his teeth had begun to chatter, and he knew deep down there was no other choice. She laid down near the fire on a thick layer of woven mats and furs, and looked at him with no fear, only calm, and something else that glowed faintly in her eyes, like curiosity mixed with something older. "Come here, human," she said, and her voice carried something more than invitation, something close to command, but still soft like the wind before the lightning. He lay down beside her slowly and tried not to think too much as her body pressed close against his, her warmth strong and steady, and her scent thick with earth and breath and something he could not name. Her arm moved across his chest, and her leg wrapped around his like She had done this before. Like this was more than survival, and her tail curled gently around his waist. You are too tense, she whispered. This will not work if you stay like stone. Rian tried to relax, but his mind raced with thoughts of trust and danger. And her words from the night before about bonds and choices and the mark that still glowed faintly on his shoulder. She touched that mark now, her fingers soft but sure, and her claws gently tracing the lines as if reading a map etched into his skin. This is not just warmth, she said. This is connection. This is the old way, the deep way, the way that binds flesh and spirit. He turned his head to look at her, and their eyes met, and in that moment the storm outside seemed to fade, and all he could hear was the sound of her breathing and the beat of his own heart echoing like a drum in his ear. Sari leaned in, and her nose brushed his neck, and she inhaled deeply before letting out a sound like a low growl of approval, and her lips touched the skin just beneath his jaw. You carry strength, she said, not just in your body, but in your scent, in your heat, in your will, and that is what I chose. He swallowed hard, and his hand moved without thought to rest against her side where her heartbeat pulsed, strong and steady like the rhythm of the earth itself. This bond is not only for survival, she said, it is for legacy. It is for what comes after. It is for the new path that no tribe has walked before. Rian felt her body shift, and her warmth pressed even closer, and something inside him stirred like a memory, not his own, something ancient and wild and hungry to be part of something greater. Their breaths matched now, and the firelight danced across their skin and fur, and the cave held only the sound of wind and heartbeat and the quiet hum of something being sealed, something more than words or promises. Sari reached for his hand and placed it on her stomach, which was warm and firm and alive with heat that seemed to reach into him and pull something deep from within. We begin now, she said, not with fear, but with choice, not with law, but with instinct, and with fire, and with flesh, and you are not prey anymore, not to me, not to this world. Rian felt the last of the cold fade as his body gave in, not in weakness, but in understanding, and in that moment he stopped thinking and started feeling, and the cave became a cradle for something new, something wild and unspoken. When the storm passed the next morning, the cave was quiet and still, and the fire had burned down to glowing coals, and Rian woke with Sari curled against him, her arm across his chest, and her breathing deep and peaceful. He looked at her face and saw something soft there, something free of worry and full of promise, and then she opened her eyes and smiled. Now, the den will not be so empty for long, she said with a grin, and pressed his hand to her stomach once more. Your heat has done more than keep me warm, human. It has started a future one this world has never seen before. The sun never truly rose on this strange planet, but the sky turned a soft pale green as the storm faded and left the ground wet and steaming and filled with a scent that made Sari's nose twitch as if something familiar had touched the air. And Rian watched her from the edge of the cave, his fingers still resting on the mark that pulsed faintly on his shoulder. She moved slowly now, not with weakness but with caution, her hands resting often on her stomach as if checking for signs that only she could understand, and her eyes were sharp, always scanning the distant hills and broken lands for shapes that might not belong. Rian asked if something was wrong, and she shook her head but did not smile, and said only, the air speaks of change, and we must listen to it or be lost. They gathered supplies as best they could, though most of it came from roots and dried strips of meat that Sari had prepared before he had ever arrived, and she gave him tools to help sharpen his senses. Small stones that held scent and claws that masked his trail. As night came again, a strange wind swept through the cave, and it was not cold like before, but warm and heavy, and filled with pressure that made the walls seem to breathe. And the fire flicker without cause. Sari stood at the entrance and lifted her nose to the sky, and her ears turned slowly, as if catching voices that had no sound, and her tail stiffened as a growl formed deep in her throat. Rian stepped forward and asked what she heard, and her answer came with eyes that did not blink. They are near, she said, not close yet, but close enough to smell what I carry, and they will not stay silent forever. Who are they? He asked, and her lips curled slightly as she spoke. The pack I left, the blood I turned from the brothers who swore to protect me until I chose the path they feared, and they will come because they think I am weak now, and they will see you as nothing but prey wrapped in my scent. He reached for his weapon, and his pulse began to rise, but Sari placed a hand on his chest and shook her head slowly. You Cannot fight them the way you fought before, she said. They do not fear blades, they fear truth, they fear change, they fear what we have made together, and what now grows inside me. That night she did not sleep. Instead, she sat near the fire with her back straight and her ears always turning and her hands resting on her stomach as she hummed, softly, a sound like wind in tall grass or rivers under moonlight. Trian stayed close, but his thoughts were loud and full of worry and questions and fear of what would happen if others like her came with hate in their eyes and blades in their hands. Then, without warning, a howl ripped through the air outside, not close, but not far, and it was long and full of power and rage and something ancient that made Rian's skin prickle and his heart free. Sari stood slowly, and her eyes flashed in the firelight and her body tensed like a bow ready to snap, and she whispered words in her old tongue that made the fire crackle louder. He asked her what it meant, and she answered with steady voice, "They call for me, and they call for the old judgment, and they will want me to return to the path I left and leave behind what I have chosen here." Rian said he would fight if they came, and Sari looked at him with something deep in her gaze, something fierce and warm and sad all at once. "You would die for me," she said, not as a question but as a truth already known, and he nodded. And she placed her hand on his cheek and said, "Then they will see what kind of prey you truly are." The next morning came with silence too, deep to trust, and the sky stayed heavy and the wind held no scent, and Sari moved through the cave like a shadow, preparing bundles and sharpening her own claws with stones older than the war Rian had fought in. When they sat to eat, she barely touched the food, and her hand never left her belly, and her eyes watched the cave mouth like it might speak or open. Old Bledrian asked how much longer, and she replied, "Not long now, and when the howl comes again it will be closer, and it will not be alone, and I will not run." That night she did not hum. Instead she placed a stone in each corner of the cave and lit them with a spark from her claws, and they glowed with a dull red light that pulsed in time. With her breath, Rian lay beside her with one hand resting on his blade and the other on her hand, and they said nothing because words would only break the silence that now held them both. Outside in the dark, something moved, and the earth began to tremble, and from the far hills came the second howl, and it was louder and deeper and full of hunger, and it echoed across the valley like a warning to all who listened. The morning came heavy with silence, and the sky hung low with mist that refused to move, and Rian stood just outside the cave, gripping his weapon tight, as if it would matter against what waited beyond the rocks, and the air smelled thick with tension, and the strange scent of fur and fire mixed with something older that made his heart beat faster. Sari stepped beside him, her ears turning, her nose twitching, her eyes locked on the hill where the second howl had come from, and her tail was still, not curled and calm like before, but sharp and ready like a drawn blade made of bone and instinct. "They are close now," she said, and her voice held no fear, only weight like stone that had waited to fall, and her hand brushed across the mark on his shoulder, as if to remind him he was not alone anymore and never would be again. Rian asked if they would come to talk or to fight, and she gave a short sound that might have been a laugh, but carried no joy. "They will speak first because that is the way of the old blood," she said, "and then they will test us, and if we fail, they will try to end what we are and what I carry and what you have become." Before he could reply, a shadow moved across the hilltop, and another, and then two more, and the mist parted as four figures stepped into view, tall and lean, with fur of black and gray and gold and eyes that glowed like fire in deep snow. Sari walked forward slowly, her step sure and steady, and Rian followed with his blade low, but his stance strong and ready, and the four figures stopped at the edge of the flat stone that sat between the hill and the cave. They one in front stepped forward, and his fur was dark and thick, and his eyes burned red, and his voice came out deep and low like stone rolling down a mountain. "You left the path, Sari," he said, "and took a human mate, and now you carry his blood, and that is a shame to us and to the bond we were born to protect." Sari raised her head and met his gaze without blinking and said, "I chose the path because it was mine to choose, and the blood I carry now is strong and full of life and not weak like fear and pride." The other three growled low and took a step forward, but the leader held out his hand and said the bond was not yours to give to prey, and now you must face what comes. Rian stepped forward and said, "If you think I am prey, then test me and see what happens," and his voice was not loud but full of heat that surprised even him. The leader turned his gaze to Rian, and his lips pulled back into something like a sneer, and he said, "You speak with courage. But you know nothing of what this bond means to us and what it breaks when done without." The old right Sari stepped between them, and her voice came sharp like frost and fire. "The right is not broken," she said. "The bond shows itself, and the mark speaks, and the life inside me does not lie, and it carries your blood and his together, and that is something none of you can undo." The leader stared at her and then at Rian, and then his eyes dropped to her stomach, where the bond pulsed through her like light beneath her skin, and his ears twitched and his breath came out slow. "If you carry his litter, then you must stand and defend it," he said, "and not with words but with strength and truth and pain and fire, and we will see if your choice is worth survival." Rian stepped forward again and lifted his blade, but Sari placed a hand on his chest and said, "Not you, not yet. This is mine to face first." And she turned to the pack and said, "I will show you the bond is real, and I will show you the old blood does not fear change." The leader circled her slowly, and the others watched with hungry eyes, and Rian felt his grip tighten as he tried to stop himself from rushing in, but he knew this was more than a fight. It was a test of something older than both of them, Sari. And the leader clashed without warning, their claws sparking, their voices silent, and their bodies moving faster than Rian could follow, and he saw blood and fur and teeth, and the sound of impact echoed through the hills, but Sari did not fall, and her strikes came fierce and sharp, and her body moved like wind through broken branches, and after many heartbeats the leader stepped back, blood on his arm and pride gone from his face. "The bond stands," he said, and the others dropped to one knee, their heads bowed and their ears low, and the mist around them began to fade like breath from a mouth that no longer needed to hold secrets. Rian ran to Sari and held her as she trembled from pain, but smiled through her fangs and said, "They see now, they see what we are and what we will be, and they cannot stop it." And far above them the sky began to clear, as if even the stars knew something had changed forever. The air inside the cave felt heavier than before, and Sari lay on the nest of thick furs with her body shaking and her breath short and sharp, and Rian sat beside her with his hand on her arm, trying to keep calm as her eyes flashed with pain and light, and her claws dug deep into the mats beneath her. The pack had left after the challenge, not in anger, but with respect and silence, and the leader had said only one thing before vanishing into the mist: "Your choice stands, and so does your trial, and we will return when the first breath comes, and when it does, the judgment of the pack will be final." Now the time had come, and Rian could feel it in the cave walls, and in the way Sari gripped him without words, and in the strange warmth that filled the space like fire trapped beneath the stone. Her body twisted with the effort of what was coming, and her tail curled tightly, and her fangs clenched as she forced herself not to cry out, though her whole frame trembled with the storm inside her. Rian kept a cloth near and water warmed by the fire, and though he had never helped in a birth, not even among his own kind, he knew that his hands were all she had, and his voice was the only thing holding her together. She growled softly, and her ears flattened, and she whispered the old tongue again and again, words that sounded like prayers or curses or both, and sweat ran down her neck as her back arched and her breath came out like steam. Rian spoke her name over and over, not loudly but with steady rhythm, like a drum, like a pulse, like a promise, and he held her when the pain made her twist, and held her when her eyes filled with fear and fire. The glow on her stomach pulsed brighter with each moment, and Rian could see movement beneath the skin, soft and strange and full of life that was not fully hers and not fully his, and something new that did not yet belong to either world. Then came a sharp gasp that broke into a low howl, and her body seized, and she cried out with all her breath, and the first small shape slipped free into Rian's shaking hands, and it was warm and wet and covered in fine silver fur, and it blinked up at him with eyes that shone like amber fire. Sari reached out and touched the newborn with one trembling hand, and her expression softened even through the pain as she whispered its name in a voice he could barely hear. More came after that, each one with a different sound and color and scent, but all with the same glow that tied them to both of their bloodlines, and Rian helped with each one and laid them gently at her side, while Sari cradled them with arms that no longer trembled. 6 in total, and each one strong and breathing and full of something that made the cave feel like a heart that had just started beating for the first time. Rian sat back against the stone and let out a long breath, and his arms were stained and his eyes wide with awe, and he looked at Sari, who now rested with the newborns curled against her, and her chest rose and fell slow. "And deep you did it," he said softly, and she smiled weakly and nodded, and her hand reached for his, and squeezed it with what strength she had left. "They are ours," she whispered, "and no one can take that away, not." Now not ever outside the cave the wind picked up, and with it came the sound of feet, not loud but many, and not rushing but steady and sure, and Rian stood slowly and stepped to the entrance where the pack began to gather again, their eyes low and their voices silent. The leader stepped forward and looked past Rian into the cave where the light of the fire danced across the small sleeping forms, and his eyes narrowed as he took in the scent that filled the air. He said nothing at first, only dropped to one knee, and the others followed, and the sound of breath seemed to stop for a moment in the whole valley. Then he spoke, and his voice was lower than before and held something close to wonder. "The blood has mixed and the line has changed, and no law can deny what now breathes in this." Denrian turned and looked at Sari, who was watching him with soft eyes and a quiet smile, and then he looked back at the pack and said, "If they are part of your world, then I will protect them as part of mine." The leader nodded and stood and said, "Then protect them well, human, for they will carry more than names and more than strength. They will carry the future and the fire and the howl of a new kind." And with that the pack turned and vanished once more into the hills, and the night grew still, and the only sound was the soft breath of life that had never existed before this moment, this bond, this choice. The suns began to rise together for the first time since the storm, and their golden light poured through the cave entrance like a blessing that touched everything inside with warmth and glow, and Rian stood at the edge of the stone ledge with one hand resting on the cave wall and the other near the hilt of his blade, though he no longer held it like a weapon, but like a memory. Behind him Sari lay curled around the 6 pups, with her body curled in the shape of a shield and her tail wrapped tight around them all, and her breath was slow and deep as she watched Rian from under heavy eyelids filled with pride and peace and something softer that had not been there before. The den was quiet except for the soft yips and shifting of the newborns and the sound of crackling from the fire as the last of the wood turned to embers, and the air was no longer heavy with tension or fear, but with the stillness that follows great change. Rian stepped back inside and knelt beside the pups and looked at each one again, and every time he did their tiny glowing eyes looked back at him, and he saw something different in each one, something ancient and something new, something fierce and something gentle, and all of it felt like a dream that had chosen to stay. Sari lifted her head and spoke with a voice still thick from exhaustion but full of strength. "They are more than us now," she said, "and they will need both worlds if they are to survive and if they are to lead." He nodded and touched the smallest pup, whose fur shimmered like moonlight, and said, "Then we give them both, and we teach them both, and we never let either world take them fully." They rested through the morning, and when the shadows shifted again, Sari stood with effort and began to clean and prepare as if the world had not changed forever, and Rian helped her, without speaking, because no words were needed, and everything he felt was already written in the soft marks that now covered both of their skins. Later the pack returned, not with challenge this time, but with gifts and food and old stones carved with symbols Rian did not yet understand, and they bowed their heads as they entered the cave and placed their offerings in silence at the foot of the sleeping pups. The leader came last, and his eyes met Sari's, and he said, "You have done what none have done in many lifetimes, and you have opened a door that none could open without war, and now we must learn from you and from him, and from the children who carry what we do not yet understand." Sari said, "Then you must swear to protect them, not as beasts, not as blood, but as kin." And the leader bowed his head and replied, "By the howl I swear." And the others echoed the sound that rose like music through the cave and over the valley and into the sky. Rian stood with his hand over his chest and listened as the sound wrapped around him like a cloak, and he felt something shift, again not in his body but in the world itself, as if the planet had accepted this change and would now move forward with it. Days passed, and the pups began to crawl and explore, and their eyes opened wider and their steps grew stronger, and they played with each other in bursts of joy and strange snarls that always ended with laughter, or tiny howls that made Sari's ears twitch and Rian's heart swell. He built a new fire ring outside the cave and used stones the pack had brought and made tools with what metal he could salvage from the wreckage of his pod, and he began to carve wooden shapes for the pups to chew and play, and he taught Sari how to set traps for small game using human designs, and she taught him how to track by scent and how to feel the wind before it changes. They were no longer just survivors and no longer just mates and no longer just part of something old, because now they were creators and builders and parents of a future that had no name but needed their hands to shape it one night as the stars blinked high above and the pups slept huddled in a tight circle with their tails over their eyes. Sari and Rian sat by the fire and looked over the valley and said nothing for a long time. Then Sari turned and looked at him and smiled with her fangs just showing and said, "You were not ready when I told you to prepare, and now look at you." Rian laughed softly and took her hand and said, "Maybe no one is ready for what matters most. Maybe we only become ready after it happens, and maybe that is enough." She leaned against him, and her tail wrapped around his waist, and they sat in the quiet warmth while the stars turned slowly and the fire burned low, and the future of two worlds slept behind them, waiting to rise with the next dawn.